This session today, and it is on the record just for everyone's awareness. But welcome to this session, Analysis to Action, from the Center for Climate and Security, looking at advancing climate security in the Biden administration. And I'm really excited to see so many folks here. I know there's been a lot of climate activities and events and discussions lately, and we're pleased that you're taking the time to join us here to take stock of where we are almost a year into the administration and where we're going next. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Erin Sikorsky. I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security here in Washington, and we are a nonpartisan institute focused on the nexus of climate change and national security. We facilitate policy development processes and dialogues. We conduct research, communicate to the public, and act as a resource hub in the climate and security field. As I already noted, it's really been a busy time for climate change and national security. Of course, there was COP, but also the release of a slew of new reports and documents from the administration on tackling climate security across the various agencies. There's the new USAID climate strategy that's out for comment right now. We expect a few more documents from various agencies before the end of the year. And as I said when we started, what we really wanted to do today was just take a moment to kind of take stock of where we are and look forward, right? As the administration is preparing its national security strategy and national defense strategy, how can and should it integrate the findings of the reports that were just released, what happened at COP into those documents? And as we've spent much of the past year getting to agreement, I think, within the US on the problems and the challenges related to climate security, we need to look to next year to think at this more about this question of how, the action part of our title, right? Analysis to action. So what should we expect in the budget request? What do we want to see in terms of institutional changes, new modalities for working? How can we sustain progress on climate security in the long run, which is a whole bunch of questions and a lot of fodder for discussion today. And it's good that we have this all-star panel here of folks to help answer these questions and move forward the conversation. Everyone on this panel today has deep experience within government tackling these issues, and they're all now key leaders outside of government advancing climate security. And I'm really happy that they're all here to join us. They're great colleagues, they're all great friends. And I know I'm gonna learn a lot from all of them today. And the way we've designed this is I'm going to introduce each one of them now, provide a short introduction of who they are, and then we're gonna turn to each of them to give us, about 8 to 10 minutes of opening remarks. I've given them some shaping questions for each of them to hone in on their expertise and experience, and then we'll have time for a broader Q&A and discussion. And I'll encourage everyone, as usual in these seminars, to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to put your questions in to the group, and I will read those questions out. But without further ado, let me introduce each of our panelists, because again, they're a really great group. Hopefully they're well known to many of you already, but let me just go over their experience really quickly. First is Sherri Goodman, who is here as a senior strategist and advisory board member at the Center for Climate and Security. She's also the chair of the board of our parent organization, the Council on Strategic Risks, and she serves as the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She's also has a senior role at the Wilson Center right now. And as you may know, Ms. Goodman served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, where she established the first environmental safety and health performance metrics for the department. She's credited for educating a generation of US military and government officials about the nexus between climate change and national security, using her phrase that she coined, threat multiplier, to fundamentally reshape national discourse on the topic. And I can also say personally, she's a great mentor and a great leader to all of us in this space. Our second speaker today will be John Conger. He is Director Emeritus of the Center for Climate and Security. He is the big shoes that I am filling now in this position. He also acts as a senior advisor to our overall organization, the Council on Strategic Risks and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Previously, John served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller at the Department of Defense. And prior to his service as Deputy Comptroller, he oversaw energy installations and environmental policy throughout DoD, including base closure, energy security, and climate change. He also has a wealth of experience on Capitol Hill, which he brings to this conversation as well. Then I'm really pleased that we're joined by Dr. Tegan Blaine today, who is the Senior Advisor on Environment and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP, she led the climate change team in USAID's Bureau for Africa for over a decade. She developed USAID's strategy and investment plan for its climate change work in Africa and built and led the team that provided thought leadership and technical support to USAID's Africa missions. Dr. Blaine has also served as a policy advisor on water at the Department of State. Finally, last but definitely not least, is Dr. Rod Schoonover, who is the head of the Ecological Security Program here at the Council on Strategic Risks. He's also a member of the advisory board for the Center for Climate and Security. And I feel like these days my partner in crime in many different projects and activities, which I love. Dr. Schoonover served in the US intelligence community for a decade as senior analyst and senior scientist in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at State Department. He also served as the Director of Environment and Natural Resources at the National Intelligence Council. When he was at the NIC, he oversaw long-range strategic analysis for environmental, ecological, and scientific issues for the US intelligence community. Prior to joining the government in 2009, Dr. Schoonover was a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. You may ask him why he left California for Washington, D.C., but we're really glad that he did, and he's here with us today. And then lastly, I also just wanted to introduce Brigitte Hugh, who is working with us at the Center for Climate and Security, and without whose help today's event would not be possible, and really happy to have her here. And if you have any technical difficulties or logistical questions during the discussion, please feel free to ping her directly. Well, okay, so with that said, let's get to the fun part, which is the discussion. And first, we're going to turn it over to Sherri to kick things off for us today and really kind of set the stage in terms of where we're at and where we're going on climate security administration. So Sherri, over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for your leadership now at the Center for Climate and Security. We're so happy to have you here. We feel that's really terrific, and what a great group we have here today. John Conger and I can sometimes finish each other's sentences in this space, so I'll try not to say all yours before I speak. And Rod, who's such a great leader, and we're so pleased to have you here at the Center for Climate and Security and the work that you bring in. Tegan, I've always loved your work as well. So thank you for being a part of this team, and Brigitte. And I see so many of you attendees. You're all experts. We're all experts here together in this space. So I'm not going to go back through the history of the threat multiplier in the military advisory board today, although I did speak early this morning to a NATO conference on climate change from Sofia, Bulgaria, and they're all in on climate action and creating this new center on climate and security, and many from Eastern Europe. And it was really great to see them getting down into the details about how to do that. So where are we a year in? And this is a tribute to so many of you I can see who are attendees. I can't see everybody's name, but I know Jen DeCicero, Josh Busby, others I don't see who are in the administration working on bringing climate security action to reality. So my hat's off to you. You've translated so successfully a body of work that's been building over at least the last 15 years, if not longer, on climate and security, and reflected in many reports and documents, particularly the Center for Climate Security's Climate Security Plan for America over many years, but then really brought forward even much further in the President Biden's executive orders on climate and security. Many of the reports that have followed from that, and then reflected to some extent at what's happened in Glasgow. I mean, climate security, let's be honest, was not front and center at the COP, but it was an integral part of the groundwork. And then so many more people are aware of the global security threats that we face and are talking about it as the most existential crisis ever. And it's really mainstream. So when you hear Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations talking about how we need to really put this front and center in our relations with China and in the global world. You know that, okay, it's hit the mainstream, just as one example. And so where are we today? I think we're really on a good path to mainstreaming climate and security across certainly the US, if not across major national security institutions globally. And that's a major accomplishment. It's not to say we've solved the climate problem by any means. We're still, my assessment is on the COP is, we made a lot of good commitments. We raised the bar some, but we have so much more to deliver, And you can hear it in the voices of both the youth and the developing countries and the small island states that are really on the front lines, feel themselves every day on the front lines of this crisis, and with its most urgency of this generation and of their lifetimes, that we really have so much more to do. So we have to keep working at it. Now, I'd say where are we right now, November 21, compared to where we were a year ago? My hat's off to the administration team for producing such an advanced set of executive orders, and then getting all the agencies to put out very compelling and well-crafted reports, in less than a year. And as I think I'll have to give John credit for this, he said these are often, reports that plan to plan, and so so they don't tell you exactly how the money's going to flow from that. And as we sometimes say, strategy without resources is hallucination. So now it's up to there's some money in the 22 budgets, but we expect we'll see more money in the 23 and out year budget requests to implement so much of what's put forward in both all the agency climate adaptation plans, the defense climate risk assessment, the first of its kind, I think really broke some new ground there in really shaping climate risk analysis across the Department of Defense, the National Intelligence Estimate on climate change, which is also, again, a first of its kind, the Climate Migration Report, a new USAID strategy, which I'm sure Tegan will talk about, and there are many others, DHS strategies as well. So let me say part of it is in the most important thing we're going to do now is develop that climate literacy and that cadre of next generation climate security professionals across the government. And many of you who are in today are that. And so I salute you for that. And I hope we will see many more. For example, I see Steve Dornbus, who's the first ever climate scientist in Air Force weather. That's a great new addition. We should have climate security professionals at all the COCOMs now. And they should be working as they implement the elements of the defense climate risk analysis, and at other levels of command too. Whether it's at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So let me just tick off a couple of things I think that we'll see on infrastructure and installations. Now we've got to take the Defense Climate Assessment Tool, which DoD has been applying at its military bases, and then take those results, and they have to be prioritized into funding for resilience at the most important critical installations. And so that's sort of the next step in that process, in using advanced analytics there. And here I would say one of the things that the administration needs to help DoD and other agencies determine is what is the standard for the climate science information on which they're going to rely. NOAA, characterizes itself as the climate science provider, but there's no official authority yet beyond the IPCC, which doesn't, has to be really stepped down to the local and specific level. So I think that's one area where the climate science working group, climate security working group that's been reconvened can address. Secondly, for our troops, The big emphasis, as Deputy Secretary Hicks has talked about, is focus on extreme heat impacts on our troops. And I think that's an underexamined area, and I'm really looking forward to the work to integrate sort of the health concerns for our forces and reduce the readiness impacts for our troops as they have to deploy and train in hotter and more extreme conditions. I think that's going to be really important, and that's going to be a way to continue to gain the bipartisan support, as well as in the infrastructure area that's necessary to sort of integrate climate resilience. Then, of course, third, the big area is going to be the weapon systems and our procurement process, where really decarbonization is most fundamental. And there, the Department of Defense, along with other agencies, have the opportunity in certain sectors to lead by example by using the buying power of the military, either in electric vehicles, in charging stations, in microgrids, and the whole assembly of ensuring more low carbon energy resilience across the military, and then in the supply chain, which could be a whole talk in itself. So I will just leave it there. And I'll end by saying, the performance standards for all of this and the metrics and measures we use are going to be vital, so that in another year we can say, okay, we sought this amount of money to meet these particular goals, and here's what we've achieved. And that would go a little bit short shrift to sort of the whole geostrategic area, because I didn't want to take the time to walk around the world. But again, in each of the combatant commands, as they integrate the climate risk analysis requirements into their theater operational planning and upgrade their combatant command operational plans, their strategic plans, it will have to be climate relevant and climate smart. And I look forward to, and I hope some of you working inside will help the COCOMs as they shape their testimony for the posture hearings coming up this spring, to really reflect how they're integrating the geostrategic elements of climate change into their thinking. So thank you all for the work you're doing, and it's a great pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Sherri. That was a great kind of overview and start to the conversation. We're now going to turn to John, and he's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the National Defense Strategy and thinking about how does bringing a climate lens to that document work, and what do we need to think about there. John?
Thanks, Erin, and great lead in, Sherri. I was just jotting down all of the things that I was going to say that you said, so that was really helpful. I'm sure I can fill 10 minutes anyway, though. But that all said, so as we think here about how we're going to turn analysis into action and what the next steps are, I think that the National Defense Strategy and National Security Strategy are the next documents. And yes, we are sort of focused on planning documents and guidance documents at this point. We've had a cascade of them, and we've seen them all, and they're wonderful. I have to say, having worked on the climate change adaptation roadmap in 2014, the climate adaptation plan that the Department of Defense just put out is better than my document, but it also sort of is the next step. So I would hope that it would be, and it leads into much more activity. As we think about sort of, acknowledging the problem and then putting out guidance and then planning and finally execution, it all sort of blends together, right? Your leading into action comes from these plans, because you want to be living in an environment where you are doing ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, aim. And so, obviously some folks are going to want a faster start. I respect that. But we really do have to do the thinking and the planning ahead of time before we start acting. Now, I wanted to take a step back because we are on the cusp of seeing these national security strategy documents, the National Defense Strategy, and so on, and look back at the ones that we've had in the past. Now, in 2010, the QDR, and in 2014, the QDR, both identified climate change as a threat multiplier, an instability accelerant, I think was one of the turns of phrase, which I quite like. But of course, threat multiplier was better because Sherri came up with it, and we have to give credit where credit's due. But that all said, in 2018, climate wasn't in the document per se. With the National Defense Strategy, which was the sort of successor document to the Quadrennial Defense Review in 2018, didn't really mention climate change. But you can read between the lines to see that climate change couldn't be avoided if you're going to execute that strategy. It talks repeatedly about an increasingly complex global environment. Well, one of those complexities is climate change. It talks about how the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. I think that's a really good point. And, as you saw soon after the strategy was released, Tyndall Air Force Base was flattened by Mother Nature. And we saw a hurricane hit in North Carolina, and we saw Offutt Air Force Base flooded by, the Missouri River overflowing, and so on and so forth. So the homeland not being a sanctuary is a really important theme, and it's one that is hand in glove with climate change. And you can't talk about it without noting that. Cyber threats are very important. Make no mistake, and that's a lot of what they meant. But the fact of the matter is that climate change did more damage than the cyber attacks in this context, and certainly to our installations. And so we have to look at what's actually happening rather than what's theoretical. And so in that context, I think it's important to think this through. So then let me unpack for a second what the National Defense Strategy talked about as their strategy. It was focused on Russia and China, and I think that's appropriate. We talk now about how China is the pacing threat. Back in the Obama administration, it was Russia and China also, but it was we had an acronym, because everything is an acronym. It was CRICKET. So it's China, Russia, Iran, Korea, terrorism. CRICKET. So you always went back to those 5 threats. And so, listening to people talk about how the National Defense Strategy was all that different, it wasn't all that different. It was a continuation of a lot of things. And so in that context, if you look at the 3 pillars, they talked about increasing lethality. Well, I don't know how you have a lethal force without incorporating resilience. And so, it's hard not to include climate change in that conversation. They managed to, but the fact of the matter is that it's very easy to reinsert and not have it be all that big a change. And then they talked about strengthening partnerships and alliances. Well, it's very clear that our partners and allies care very much about climate change. And by avoiding the topic, we sort of undermine our relationships. So you bring it in and you have that conversation, as we saw at the COP. It's a very important topic to folks, whether that's because they want to do the right thing or because it's existentially important to them. And then the last piece of there were only 3 pillars in the NDS. The third one was reform for lowering costs. Well, the fact of the matter is that if you invest in energy efficiency or renewable energy or electric vehicles or resilience, you're going to save money in the long run. And so, it all sort of fits in, and it probably took some effort not to include climate change there. And I understand that, but a lot of folks, and I'll sort of finish up with this thought. I have been seeing some things where people are concerned about how climate change might be too much of the budget and take away from things that people always wanted to fund. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that it's very easy to point to climate-informed budgeting. I think any military construction is going to be informed by climate change, and if it's not, you're just wasting money. I think that there's plenty of money we spend on energy, and that should be climate informed. I think there's plenty of money we spend on weapon systems, and that can be climate informed. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily siphon off money. Even the electric vehicle stuff, I sit there and think about how we already spend money leasing vehicles from GSA. It's not necessarily going to take new money to lease to use the same budget to lease a different kind of vehicle. You'll have to spend some on charging infrastructure, no question, but it's not like it's going to, take huge divots out of the Department of Defense in that context. I think what's more important than how much you spend is how you spend what you get, and that sort of goes full circle into the other strategy documents, and sort of speaks to the fact that it's how do you incorporate climate considerations into the normal things that you're thinking about, whether that be foreign policy and geostrategic concerns, or construction and infrastructure, or operations. And I think when you do, you will find resilience in climate competes very well as you buy as a risk that you need to buy down. And so it's not necessarily anything other than investing in mission capability. So anyway, I'll close with that and look forward to the questions.
Great. Thanks, John. And thanks for walking us through your thoughts there on the NDS in particular and how you bring that climate lens. I think that's really, really important. And now we're going to move away from DoD a bit to the other aspects of the climate reports that were released and the other security agencies that are focused on this. And we're going to turn to Dr. Blaine to talk a bit about the migration report, as well as USAID's strategy, kind of taking us out of the defense side to perhaps the conflict prevention and peace building side and the migration issues. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for organizing this panel. It's just wonderful to learn from everybody here, and I look forward to learning from all of the comments and questions of all of the participants in this panel very shortly. As Erin said, I think what I bring in terms of value add to this group is to bring a perspective on international development and peace building. And I will turn to the migration report and USAID's draft strategy. But first, I wanted to just highlight a couple of key takeaways that I got out of reading DoD's climate risk analysis and the NIE. First off, on the climate risk analysis, I really appreciated the consideration of operational challenges to the military, as well as the shifting demands on military to respond to humanitarian assistance and increase conflict around the world. I thought that it was really wonderful to have that highlighted in the climate risk analysis. And what it says to me is that it's important to think not just about the national defense strategy, but also about the regional command responses. Those are the ones that are going to be called upon to respond to requests for humanitarian assistance and respond to increased conflict around the world. And so being deliberate about how those regional commands integrate climate change into their thinking of what the demands on their forces are going to look like is an absolutely critical recognition. In addition, I found that it was interesting that there was quite a list of technical resources to continue thinking about climate risk assessment. And Sharon Burke has been really influential in my own thinking about how we begin moving towards a shared understanding of risk among the international agencies. It's important to be thinking about not just what DoD brings to the table, but what USAID and the State Department bring to the table. And I do think that a shared concept of climate risk is going to be critical for all the agencies getting on the same page and beginning to think about how they work together as partners and not just in parallel. What can they bring to the table, and how do we take on the challenges raised by climate change very deliberately as a group of agencies? Turning to the NIE, there were a couple of important points there for me as well. Number one, I really appreciated the frank discussion about the impacts of a transition to a global green economy and what that means for the risks of destabilization at a variety of scales. I also appreciated the discussion about how fragility is further exacerbated by climate change and what that means for risks to US security over the next decade. However, I want to raise one concern. And what I worry about when I go to sleep at night is, what are the risks after the first decade? What risks will explode in 15 or 20 years that early action now and engagement now could have helped mitigate and could have helped prevent? And I wouldn't say that it's short-sighted necessarily only to focus on the most time-sensitive threats, because those are absolutely critical to some of the decisions we're making right now. But I do think that it's also important that we recognize that some of the longer-term threats require action now in order for us to address them. And that kind of early action can offset some of the climate security risks for the United States in the future. So turning to migration and turning to USAID's role in this. At the same time that the DoD Climate Risk Assessment was released and the NIE, the National Security Council also released a report on the links between climate change and migration. In many ways, it was a great summary of where the international policy environment is right now. What the US government didn't do, however, was to lay out a pathway for what the US government would do in terms of an international engagement and what kinds of specific roles, specific responsibilities it would take on in beginning to tackle this kind of global problem. But taking a step back, in 2020, environmental disasters displaced over 30 million people in comparison to less than 10 million displaced by conflict. So environmental disasters are increasingly driving displacement. The World Bank estimates that almost 150 million people could be on the move due to climate change by 2050. And we're talking one generation in human terms. It's not that far away. And that close to 150 million people around the world is just in 3 major regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. This is at least 2 times larger than the impacts of World War II, which was the most recent massive displacement event. Now, migration has historically been a positive and adaptive response to climate and environmental change, and I think we do need to recognize that. It can even provide economic benefits for receiving societies. There are good aspects of migration. That said, it really requires a safe and orderly pathway to be viable and for us to see those positive outcomes. And that kind of effort to create those kinds of viable pathways really does require a level of international cooperation that I'm not sure yet exists. So just to put in perspective here a little bit about where we are currently, this is what I worry about, that there are going to be stresses on countries tackling internal displacement due to climate change at the same time that they are being impacted by displaced peoples from neighboring countries, which just leads to a compounding of risk. And we kind of, as a global climate change community, have tended to focus on small island developing states. But I do think we also need to turn our attention to landlocked, low, other developing states, especially those in arid geographies, especially those in areas of the world that are highly vulnerable to temperature change. Recent scientific reports are beginning to estimate that 30% of the global population by 2070 will live in areas that will experience a temperature that's currently only found in less than 1% of the Earth's surface. And so that's really bringing up that many geographies are going to become increasingly hospitable to human society as we know it. Either we change human society or we move. And there's risks for conflict. Climate change has increased the risk of armed conflict within countries, between 5 and 20% over the previous century. And I think all experts agree that the risk will rise as we see increasing climate change. So all of these things are the evidence base, and the risks that we face are beginning to add up and really push us towards the need to take on these challenges. So lastly, getting to the USAID draft strategy, which was released at COP in the last couple of weeks for comments. And I would encourage everybody to read it and provide comments over the next week. They're due by November 24th. For me, I see it as a really good indication of where US government is going in its partnership with many developing countries, because USAID is so critical to many of those partnerships all around the world. There were a couple of really great things in that strategy. The focus on systems change and the recognition that we need transformative action at this stage in order to address the risks that we're facing at local, national, and trans-border levels. The strategy also called out the need to harmonize humanitarian development and peace building assistance, which I think is an absolutely critical, important kind of step in the right direction. However, the USAID strategy only called out migration as an evolving consideration. And in part, that's because the responsibility for dealing with displacement and migration is split across many different agencies. And it's going to be increasingly important to think about what a shared response looks like and how different agencies can join together to work together. So in my last minute, I just wanted to talk a bit about a couple of things we need to be doing. We need to be giving people the resources to be able to stay in their communities longer and the resources to have the flexibility to choose their own direction in the future and to choose when they or if they want to migrate in response to climate change. We need to be focusing on cities. Many of these displaced people are likely to show up in rapidly developing urban areas. And I think that the risk of violence and conflict in these cities as they absorb so many more incoming residents is undervalued. And it's something that we really need to be paying attention to. We need to be thinking about regional conversations and regional planning. Our ability to help support such conversations has the potential to reduce the risk of spillover and to reduce the risk for national security risk for the United States, because many of these people will stay within the region, even if they cross over borders. And then lastly, we really need to be engaging as honest partners in the discussion about how we support international migration as part of all of the work that we're doing on climate change. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Erin.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for kind of drilling down into one aspect of these climate security issues and how it actually touches so many different things when you look at the migration question and then on with instability and conflict. I think, you know, your initial points too were so critical in connecting us to our final speaker, Rod, about building a shared understanding of climate risk across all the agencies, and also thinking about those 15 to 20-year risks in the little bit longer term. Because I think what I've asked Rod to talk about is linking science and national security as well, which is something that all of these documents to different extents take a crack at and move us forward on, but it's so critical in building that risk assessment and shared risk analysis. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod now to talk a bit about that, and then also about the National Intelligence Estimate as well, and what we see there given your experience in the IC.
Great, thank you. And I'll just say, echo again, the honor for being invited to this panel. And I've enjoyed and agreed with many of the things that have already said. So my perspective is from someone who has read climate science articles for 3 decades. It is one of the motivating factors why I came to Washington, D.C., left California. And so I have quite a strong opinion that based on scientific assessments over the last 20 years, that we've essentially passed a planetary discontinuity, and it's manifested by climate change and ecological change. And we know this from the scientific literature and the scientific community. And so the links between national security and science are not new. They go back not just for our country to the 20th century, but even well before that. What's newish is the importance of Earth system science, not just to the scientific community, but also the implications for security. We're talking about forces that are affecting practically every sector and system on the planet. So the climate science is a very dynamic field. I have a feed of scientific articles that come to me daily. There are at least 100 articles per day that are either climate or climate linked. And many of them quite relevant for security analysis, which especially in the intelligence community, they're often expected to be current on all information. And that would necessarily mean on scientific information. And, without scientific underpinnings, arguably security analysis would tend to be shallow or not broad enough to capture many of the pathways, for example, climate change poses to security. So I think it's important to think about the upcoming national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and their importance in really mobilizing efforts towards a whole host of federal activities. And so I'm paying quite a bit of attention, or I will be, in how not just does it get included, but to what degree is it central, right? And what is the tone that it takes? Do these documents, or will these documents, see climate change and ecological change as one of many issues of which we have to deal with? Or is it a central issue? Now, if you believe, like I do, that we have passed a planetary discontinuity, it argues for at least a tonal shift from what we have seen before. But moreover, just more practically, the NSS guides the security community to continue to build the scientific capacity, not just on climate science, but a whole lot of scientific fields that are relevant to this discussion, like disease ecology and agricultural science and fisheries science and forest science. You cannot just narrowly look at climate science. But this also signals to the scientific community, both inside of the federal government and outside, that their work is relevant to security, and there are gaps that are necessary to fill, and it may help guide future research towards answering these questions. And so, for a moment, let me just look at the National Intelligence Estimate. And so, this isn't the first time that the intelligence community has put out an assessment on climate change and national security. In 2016, there was a National Intelligence Council memo that was not coordinated through all of the agency heads. But in 2008, there was a national intelligence assessment that went through the same review process and in coordination that an NIE does. The trouble is that has never been declassified. Nothing in it is classified, but the document has a confidential label. Sometimes it is surprising to me that that has not been declassified. And comparing that document to this NIE, it's sort of like comparing apples and oranges, because they're scoped differently. So the NIE from last month adopts a geopolitical focus, not exclusively, but that is what its key judgments, the first two key judgments rely on. And I think the warnings are strong about what's in store ahead, just in terms of the geopolitics surrounding climate change and mitigation, but also inputs to tensions between countries. I think its focus on political instability is very appropriate, and I think that's a question that we really should think about. I know that very oftentimes when we talk about national security, people think, oh, war and conflict, but I worry much more about political instability and fragmentation and barriers to reconstruction. Now, the NIA from 2008 looked largely at the threats posed by climate change itself to agriculture, to water, from heat to power. And so in some ways, the two documents complement each other. Now, if I had to critique, I'll just follow up on Dr. Blaine's remarks. The time frame is almost always, when addressing climate change through a security lens, we always seem to get the time frame wrong. And I understand why. I was in the IC for a long time. If you start talking about time frames longer than just, I mean, you might even argue longer than 18 months, people start to shut their brain. But if you're really thinking, if you're using language like existential threat, that time frame arguably needs to be widened. And I think a lot of people, I think that critique is not just for this document. I think it applies to the worldwide threat assessment. It applies to a number of documents. I guess the second critique I would have, I'll put aside the fact that it doesn't have very much science in it. I believe that the community should show its work and how it got its answers. But putting that aside for a second, I'm not sure that the NIE, because of its scoping, tonally conveys the actual risks. So I mentioned that the idea of a planetary discontinuity that affects so many different things. Does the NIE as written reflect that? Might a casual reader come away with an understanding that climate security risks are largely the domain of the developing world, despite what we've seen in Europe, Australia, the United States, who have exhibited substantial climate vulnerability, even in the last couple of years. And so, that's just two overall takes on that document. I think if anything, it might be seen as a first step in a series of analyses that broaden the scope of climate change, as the president requested in the executive order. And I'll turn it back to you.
Great.
Erin.
Thanks, Rod. And I certainly hope as well that it is just the beginning of a series of reports, many of which we probably won't see because they'll remain classified. But I think your comments there are spot on. I'm going to take moderator's privilege now, of course, as moderators often do, to ask the first question of the group. And I know we've kind of talked about a lot of different things, but what I was hoping is we're thinking, looking ahead, looking to next year. If we were sitting in the same, hopefully we'd actually be in a real environment, not the Zoom environment next November. But if we were sitting in the same place, having the same conversation, what would you point to? What one or two things would you like to see that would convince you that you'd had a successful year in advancing climate security in the second year of the administration? What are you really focused on, or think the administration really needs to focus on in the next year, now that they've done their homework, if you will, with all these reports? And so maybe we can go in an opposite direction of how we started. So Rod, can I put you on the spot first and start with you, and we'll go backwards?
Sure. That's a great question. I think I'll just maybe answer it two different ways, but I think two appropriate ways. Where does the security community and the federal security community go with this type of analysis? How does it build its workforce? Does it integrate climate security, not just into the traditional parts of the national security community, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, but the State Department, USAID, all have aspects of the generalized national security picture. I would also be looking to see how well the federal science agencies are informing, national security questions going forward. And then the second take I would have on this would be really, are we understanding the convergence of climate and other risks? Are we anticipating them? Are we thinking about the intersection of climate change with infectious disease, right? We're living through the greatest disruption in global history, or in 100 years globally. Are we thinking about the overlap of climate change and antimicrobial disease? Are we looking at the overlap of climate change and just a whole host of other so-called non-traditional threats and traditional security threats? That's a long, that's not going to be accomplished in year two. But I think some of the groundwork in terms of the convergence of a whole lot of different worrying trends, I think is an appropriate thing to think about as a next step.
Thanks. No, that's great. I think asking the right questions, right? And continuing to move the analysis forward in new and better ways is key. Tegan?
Rod already brought up a couple of really critical points there, especially about the development of a federal workforce and how we're going to begin addressing these kinds of, converging threats. I think those are really critical points. What I might add is that I do think that the United States has to look at international cooperation with new eyes. I think the United States has avoided some of the most challenging issues, and we actually do need to get involved in those conversations. This is a national security threat if we are not at the table and beginning to work on a level of international cooperation around some of the most challenging issues. The other thing that I'd say, and this is very much shaded by my experience at USAID, is we need to see money put towards direct actions. And yes, these can be early actions, but until there are specific actions that are being funded, then it's a lot of talk. And how we begin to see these kinds of real decision points and specific actions begin to emerge from all of this thinking is going to be critical in my mind for ensuring that we're actually beginning to move forward and building commitment within the agencies to make sure that they operationalize changes.
Thanks. And can I actually ask on your first point there, when you say we need to be at the table for certain things, are there specific topics you have in mind that we're not at the table right now that we should be?
Well, I think we've been at the table for some of these, but perhaps not been the best partner in the space, because we do need to put ourselves on the line and bring commitments into the space. I do think about the loss and damage discussions as part of the UN negotiations on climate change. Another area is on better discussions about migration and displacement, where there's been an effort to develop an international agreement, but then the United States bowed out at the last minute. And so I think that those kinds of things send the wrong message about whether we are really engaging as a full partner in that space. And we do need to do a better job of thinking about what are the ramifications if we don't engage and put our own resources on the line.
Thanks. John?
So I love all this talk about resources. As the former deputy comptroller of the DoD, I have an opinion on resources that might be a little different than some other folks either listening or at the table. I believe the Defense Department budget tends to be too small, and that's just me. When you look at all the things they're asked to do versus how much money is there, it isn't enough, and you underfund lots of things. And some of the things you underfund are those resilience efforts or preventative maintenance or the kinds of things that you spend money to save money because it's a smart thing to do, but you just don't have enough money in your budget to do it. And so you set aside a lot of those smart things to do because you only have enough to keep things running at a very basic level. So I do agree that as Sherri pointed out, strategy without budget is a hallucination. I agree with Tegan's point that you want to see things start to get funded, and there's going to be some things that get funded. I think that you'll see some of that in next year's budget request. I think that you'll see some of that funded in this year's budget request, but there's a lot of money that's going to get appropriated from this year that they're going to spend in different ways. And I think that's really important. It doesn't have to be a silo and it doesn't have to be a bucket. It has to be about changing the way you do your normal day-to-day job in such a way that you incorporate these considerations, whether that's how I build a building and using different building codes with the same money, or choosing the zero cost decision to place it at a higher elevation rather than down in the floodplain. Those are smart things to do that we can do with current money, and decisions that you can make that don't necessarily cost extra, but still are climate informed. And I think one of the other pieces that if I'm looking back a year from now, one of the things I would really like to see is the climate literacy and climate considerations be integrated into some of the training and education across the government. DoD has a lot of professional military education. I really want to see climate change integrated, not as a silo, but as something that everybody has to consider as they're doing what they would normally consider their day jobs. I think that's really important as well. But a year from now, let's be clear, a year from now, we're not going to even have passed the FY23 budget. It will be a request, and maybe we'll have a House mark and probably not a Senate mark yet, and that won't get passed until Christmas. And so all we're going to be doing is executing what's pending now a year from now, which is glacial, I know, but it's how the system works. And to succeed, you have to work within the system. I want to go back to one last point. I know I'm talking too much, but Tegan made a really good point about timelines. And, we always think about near term. Yes, that's the way it works. And then we have these catastrophes we talk about that are going to happen in the second half of this century. But the 10 to 20 year crises are under-examined and under-discussed. And from a security point of view, those are the ones we need to get preparing for. And they're different than what's happening today, and they're different from what's going to happen in 100 years. And so working that into our planning process is going to be really important. So somebody needs to start thinking about, if we have to do more disaster response, what does that look like? If there's more domestic or international disaster response, what does that look like? What do our aid programs need to look like? Do we put more money into health programs and AIDS in Africa than resilience, and is that the right mix? And so on and so forth. So I think that starting to mainstream and to integrate climate into everybody's normal decision-making considerations, even if it's not new money, is going to be really important.
Thanks, John. Sherri.
Okay, thanks. Agreeing with all the comments already made, I'll just add some fine points to it. I think if I'm sitting in the administration, I want to show some deliverables on this set of executive orders and reports in another year, heading into the midterm elections. I think some things that could be visible and one could talk about that are concrete and reflect what's embedded in the executive order and in the reports is, one, I'd like to see some specific war games and modeling and simulation that people can talk about. We've had one already, the Elliptic Thunder that the Recess Group put together with Annalise and others. There should be more, and the COCOM, the combatant commander, should be able to talk about them. I'm going to do them, or I've done them, or here's the shape, here's the kind of scenario I'm concerned about, and that's why. So I want that to be in the whether it's an Arctic scenario, a Sahel scenario, each one for each combatant command, ideally, at least. The second is, because of the focus on the extreme heat and the troops, it would be good to talk about a plan, if not specific actions, that's going to reduce the number of Black Flag days and lower risk to our troops. I think that could be very powerful, and also better showcase some of the research that we need to do to understand the impact of heat on people, our troops, of course, but it's going to affect like all individuals. And so that can have spillover benefits beyond defense. The workforce, certainly we've seen a lot of climate advisors go in across various parts of the Department of Defense and other agencies in this administration. I expect there'll be more. So being able to showcase that workforce as well, I think is very important. And then some concrete numbers around. We've talked a lot about how the missions for the military are changing to reflect the need for greater, what either we call HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or the defense support to civil authorities. But basically, we're focused more on the home game because of the domestic natural disasters that are climate fueled, as much as the away game. Not to underplay the importance of all the development work and the work we need to do with our allies and partners overseas. I think that's vital, but being able to put some numbers around that and explain why and show how we're resetting our force to incorporate the greater focus, because that reflects in some ways the administration's focus on foreign policy begins at home. And that's part of this climate lens. And then some real showcase. I'd be looking for some good showcases on both resilience building that incorporate low carbon and decarbonized energy solutions at military bases. There have been obviously some demonstrations of microgrids and others out at Miramar. What's the next big set of demonstration efforts that reduce, that put us on a lower carbon path at a particular critical military base? There's a number of them around the country, and that also help build resilience to the next extreme weather event.
Great. Thank you, Sherri. Those are some really concrete ideas and examples. And I love the wargaming one in particular, and thinking through how each of the COCOMs gets there, which actually brings us to our questions from the audience. And folks, please add them into the chat box, or actually please add them into Q&A if possible. You can add them into the chat box as well, but we already have quite a few. And one of the first I wanted to ask about is, how do we bring this whole of government approach to the regional and single country level? Is there a need for more delegated authority to regional levels, say at USAID and Department of State, to parallel the delegated authority that the COCOMs have? How might we drive better interagency collaboration at that country team level? So anyone want to tackle that question?
Well, it might be partly stepping down to the country team level some of the types of interagency cooperation that have been showcased through groups like RECESS or the Climate Security Working Group, and enabling that to happen at various levels. It's so that you can enable that, and I think that's very that's very important to have this happen at multiple levels, but also not stop good things from happening because it has to be coordinated all the way to the top, because sometimes that becomes a roadblock in itself. So you don't want to necessarily have to get, mother may I permission at the top levels. You want to empower people at the lowest level of decision making to act.
Could I add a thought onto that too?
Please.
So when we look at what the State Department is doing and looked at their climate adaptation plan, it's very physical in nature, right? It's here's what we're doing at our embassies and so on. What I'd really have loved to have seen from them was something talking about how their country teams were going to integrate climate change into regional assessments. I didn't quite see that. I saw a little bit of a promise in the upfront, but not really, more detail. So that would be a great thing to see come forward. But along going over to DoD for a second, and I know I do that a lot, but that's okay. The idea that DoD has done a lot more work than partner militaries on resilience is something that I hear a lot. Part of that is because security is a space where in the United States, we've been able to get some degree of consensus to work on climate change and climate resilience. And so we've seen some significant progress there. And partner militaries haven't had to. Climate change is either important enough in that country that the government is focused on decarbonization or other things, and security sort of gets left to their own devices. So those militaries are a little bit behind in some of these cases. And so I think offering up assistance and mill-to-mill cooperation to say, here's what we've learned is a really good opportunity to sort of bring climate and leverage climate for other purposes, for that sort of building relationships dynamics. And I think that's a good hook.
Great. Thanks, John. Rod or Tegan, did you have anything you wanted to add there? No? Okay. So let me move on to another question, which is keying off of Rod's comment that the apparent limit for strategic consideration is about 18 months out in the intelligence community. And I would argue that's not just the intel community, that's the entire national security apparatus. So I'm going to broaden the question a bit. The question is, how can academics outside the traditional intel community, but I'm going to say outside of the national security community writ large within government, help persuade the government or help the government think through how to extend their time horizons for climate security analysis? And this gets to that point that Tegan made about, having to take action now to shape things 20 years out. So who would like to jump in on that question to start?
Well, there's some irony in this because, people have been doing this for a while. We've been focused in some ways on reducing the time frames for analysis in order to get the attention of policymakers and budget planners. Because, the initial assessments on climate science going back 10, 12 years, we're out 50, 100 years. And a lot of people's eyes glazed over when they saw that. Even defense planners. And, so one of the first National Academy studies on the implications of climate for stability, something like that, deliberately reduced the timeframes down to 20 plus years, and then specifically looked at case studies like Pakistan of countries of strategic interest to the United States. It's like we have to walk and chew gum. I mean, we still have to get the interest of those whose timeframes for decision and action and budget planning are only in the next year to out to the FIDA, maybe. But also militaries, when you plan a weapon system, that's supposed to last quarter century or even more. So yes, the time is ripe, and a strategy. And we think of China as very strategic, and it's looking forward to a future Arctic, the Polar Silk Road, just as an example. So we have to be able to put our strategic lens on, or as Erin, you like to say, our climate lens for everything.
Great.
And if I can just jump in,
Go ahead, Rod.
and maybe, as a former academic myself, the academic community is not really the entity that is necessary here. I actually think it's interesting, just stepping back. If you look at the worldwide threat assessment, that specifically looks out 12 to 18 months, mandated by Congress for the intelligence community to appear. Curiously, there is no requirement for them to talk about threats of a longer timescale, the kind of timescales that we're talking about. And so, that kind of process, that kind of, requirement, or maybe even a request, would be a demand signal for the intelligence community outside of the Quadrennial Global Trends Project to assess longer term threats.
And if I could add one more thought to all of this, I don't think you change Washington. I think Washington is pretty well stuck doing what it's going to do. It lives in its silos and it lives in its timeframes, and the budget cycle is the budget cycle. And we're not all going to wish that away just because it's inconvenient. We have to work within that. You can't sit down at a chessboard and wish the game was checkers and expect to win. You have to figure out how to get the information across with the constraints you're given, and with the way people are thinking about it. And there are ways to do that. Maybe it's a matter of simplifying those academic studies into a few big trends or big things that will catch the attention that we're all going to have to deal with, whether it's an ice-free Arctic or something else, as a simple thing that the policymakers can get their heads around, that comes from academia, but that derives back into something that they're all going to have to wrestle with in the immediate term.
If I may, Erin, I'd like to add a little bit.
Please do.
One tool that I think that is already at our disposal, at least to address some of the climate risks and climate security issues, is the Global Fragility Act, which was passed last year, about 16 months ago. And, especially coming from USAID, where we had a 5-year timeline for the majority of our programs, one of the most significant aspects of the GFA, in my mind, is that it extended the planning timeline to a decade, which is quite significant for USAID. And the fact that that encourages agencies to think out further than they traditionally have, number one, is a great opportunity for us to start integrating climate risks into our analysis around fragility and to begin building a response on climate change into our response on fragility. But it also proves that there's some understanding that we need to be taking consideration of longer term risks and integrating that into our planning timeline in very deliberate ways. Now, obviously, it's early days for the GFA. We still need to see how the administration is going to use that extended timeline in its planning processes. But I do think that it's a really important tool for beginning to think about how we take on climate security risks in the context of fragility that we can begin using right now.
Great, thanks. No, those are all great points. I also think that using, some of the gaming and the scenarios exercises that Sherri talked about earlier, where you really get people in a mode of thinking through how their decisions today affect future actions, can be helpful. I take John's very pragmatic points, but I also think part of the goal here should be to push those boundaries a little bit, and over time you make shifts there in how business actually is done as well, which I think is important. All right, we've got a lot of other good questions. I'm gonna try and combine a couple of here. There's one about looking at the geographic combatant commands. What else can they do with theater strategy, operations, and planning that may show progress in the incorporation of climate risk? And I'm going to marry that with a question also looking at the COCOMs in the Global South in particular, and how they might think about improving partner nation climate resiliency and reduce climate associated risk. And maybe that Global South question too could be beyond the COCOMs, and just think more generally in our relationships with allies and partners, what we need to be doing there and why it's important to US national security to do it, not just because it's the right thing to do. Sherri, I see Mike, you're unmuted, so I'll let you jump in.
All right, so I just want to throw one thing out here that ties some of these threads together, and knowing Erin and Rod yesterday convened a workshop looking at climate security risks in the Levant. Okay, so we know that in that part of the Middle East, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, drought is increasing, temperatures are rising, and as you know, what was a Mediterranean climate, we talk about Israel having greened the desert, but the desert is fast encroaching back again, and even more so because of climate changes. Now, I just noted, thinking about all of that quite a bit yesterday, and then seeing that just this morning is a news story about how the UAE is supporting Jordan and Israel in putting in a major solar farm in Jordan that will enable greater desalinization. And I tell you, those who work on water and climate security in the Middle East, like EcoPeace and Guido Bromberg, have for years talked about this as a viable possibility to help both improve water conditions in the water availability in those two countries, and also clean energy through solar. And so we often don't talk about the good news. And I saw that this morning. I was like, wow, that is something that could help, begin to reduce water and climate security risks in those regions. So we should embrace those. It's not that the US can take full credit for it. There's 3 other sovereign countries involved, but certainly our support for actions like that and showcasing them are important. Andrea, I know you're going to be teaching in those classes where you're going to teach some of these games and simulations that will help the combatant commands, particularly up there at the Naval War College, thinking about the maritime domain. I think of the Caribbean, I think of the Pacific. This is where climate is some of the most existential threat to our allies and partners, and getting the COCOMs to really integrate that into their daily operational planning, not all of this is a war game. Some of it is a peace game in many ways, and should showcase the talents and the capabilities of USAID and other agencies in NOAA, for example, and many other agencies that can bring their capabilities to the fore. So I think that's going to be critical. And you can't talk about addressing the climate risk in Latin America unless we're going to deal with the climate migration issue. And that's where I think integrating, what Tegan talked about, understanding the climate migration strategy, but thinking about maybe some specific ways to operationalize that in the context of the challenges there and the way that showcases a whole of government approach.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on those questions?
Yeah, let's talk about what the COCOMs can actually do for a second. They can anticipate, right? And so as they build their operational plans, figure out how folks are going to react to climate change and plan their response. They can validate. So nations that are worried about climate change, they can go in and say, yeah, we understand and we support and we want to be able to help you out. They can collaborate, figure out ways to work together on these kinds of problems and challenges in the immediate term. And they can also participate in exercises. So, disaster response exercises are on point, are going to be more and more important, and learning to work together with our partners and allies on responding to those disasters, or even, talking to nations like China about joint disaster response kinds of activities might be worth exploring. And so that's that sort of response piece of the sort of, if you think of climate change, actions as either mitigation, lowering emissions, or adaptation, just, planning for the problems, or response, that response leg is really important and is really right in the wheelhouse of the COCOMs. And so thinking about how they can plan for those and how they might work with others in that space is real important.
Anyone else? No? All right. I'm going to move on to a question kind of in the solution space, I guess, or potential solution. There's a question about solar geoengineering, research or development there, and whether that should feature in the administration's climate security agenda as a means to mitigate climate threats and threat multipliers. If so, why not? So maybe just a conversation about, we can talk about geoengineering, and I think sometimes we put this in the risks of response category, right? What are the security risks related to responses to climate change, or is this perhaps an answer? So Rod, I'm going to ask you to kick us off on that one.
Right, and so it's a great question. It's an important question. When I was in the State Department, there was quite a reticence to even talk about it, to talk about solar, any form of geoengineering or other kinds of climate intervention, especially when the climate negotiations were so fraught. Right, this is pre-Paris. But now we have an architecture, we have a Paris Accord, we have, we have a Glasgow Accord, or whatever it's going to be called. My opinion is, and I argued it in government, is that if you don't have a strategy on geoengineering, one will be made for you. And so you might as well be proactive. You may not like to really engage in it. You may think it sends the wrong message, but you should have one. And so I don't necessarily see it as a climate security element, except as climate writ large affects security. But just putting on my science hat here, I think one of the worst things we could possibly do is deploy solar geoengineering without it being adequately researched. And so if if the United States thinks that it may be a toolbox, something in the toolbox that will be, it will be required, that it may need, they better be damn sure they understand what the effects are. And that kind of science ought not to be clandestinely conducted. It should be completely transparent. So I personally support limited, especially in silico research on geoengineering.
Thank you, Rod. That's a very good context. I'm presently chairing for the Council on Foreign Relations and Advisory Committee on governing solar geoengineering. So I'm in the middle of taking a deeper dive into this subject, particularly the governance dimension, which is so heavily lacking right now. And as Rod and others have observed, technology has a momentum of its own. And so either because research and a National Academy of Studies report a couple of years ago really documented the state of the research and development on solar radiation management and related techniques. And there's quite a bit of research that's occurred in the US, but in other countries too. And so, and at this point, we don't have a plan and a strategy. We don't have an approach in the United States for what future we would like to see. Should the technology, should ourselves or other countries or non-state actors want to deploy it? And it's some elements of it and dimensions have already begun to be used. So we need to understand both what the impacts are, what the unintended consequences are, what the regional or more global impacts could be. Could it be beneficial, but what are also the downside risks, and what are the governance mechanisms we'd like to have in place, and the discussions we'd like to have either through the UN or other mechanisms to create the right type of governance so that we can help lead the future instead of being led by it.
Thanks, Sherri. I think that governance issue applies to geoengineering, but it applies to many other issues as well. The migration one as well. How do we get ahead of the challenge on the international stage when it comes to governing these issues? I think we have time for just one last question, and I'm going to shape one that we got in here on, we've talking a lot about operationalizing climate security in the coming year. How do we also ensure that these issues are embedded in the culture of the national security institutions going forward in such a way that can outlast some of the political wins, right? Depending on who's in the White House or who's leading Congress. We've spoken to this a bit already about the education and mainstreaming, but if folks have just kind of one thought or recommendation to leave on and how we change the culture going forward. I know John says Washington never changes, but I do think changing the culture of the civil institutions themselves is something we need to think about going forward. So maybe we can do another round robin here of how we go about that. And John, I saw you already had unmuted, so you were ready to go. So maybe I'll let you go first, and then we can go to others on the panel as well. And that's how we'll end today.
So if I'm going to constrain it to one thought, I'm going to combine what you already alluded to, which is in Washington, D.C., I believe that people don't change their minds. But you can broaden their already existing definitions. So in order to change the culture, what you have to do is bring climate in to what they already believe. So if they are thinking in the security space that China is the threat, how do you fold climate into it, not pose it as an alternative for them to pay attention to? So the question is, how do you take what they're already focused on and thread and weave climate discussions, which are very relevant, into it, and not force it in places where it doesn't fit?
Thanks, John. Who would like to go? Tegan?
I'd hearken back to what John said before, which is the importance of investing in a workforce who understands these issues. You know, in spite of the last administration, USAID continued to do climate change work, in part because they had trained personnel who understood the issues, as well as demand from the countries that USAID partners with. And so that demand was absolutely critical for building willingness within the agency to do that work. But the ability to do that work was reliant on staff with the skill sets that were necessary. And so, you know, all of the executive branch agencies lost an enormous amount of talent over the last few years, but building up that talent and that workforce is going to be absolutely critical to being able to continue pushing these issues forward, no matter the political winds.
Thanks. Sherri, Rod, who would like to go next?
I'll go.
Okay.
Just very quickly, I think Build Back Better and putting science first matters for the security community as well. And just riffing off what Dr. Blaine said, there should be more scientific expertise in the security community. I mean, I'll just put a period at the end of that sentence. There are so many questions that come from not just the White House, but from across the executive branch that require some, either, if not scientific training, a scientific understanding. Hopefully you have a mix inside of these agencies. And so, you know, I don't know how you get ahead or even understand the multi-tentacled problem that climate change poses to so many different subsectors of security without having people in the system on a daily basis who understand the phenomenon.
Thanks, Rod. Sherri, last word is yours.
Well, thank you. All really great comments. And I agree, we need more Rods and more AAAS fellows like Annalise Blum and Steve Dornbus and others who are come in and bring their deep scientific knowledge, training, and expertise and learn how to do security as well, so that we've got people trained in both dimensions and many more across the board. I think that's happened. And in Earth system science, I agree. I'm on the board of UCAR, the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, which is the home of Earth system science and is affiliated universities. And we need more of them to be in the government and understand how to do policy making. So yes, very much the workforce. And then the climate risk analytics, climate tech field is rapidly developing in the civil and commercial sector. We need to take advantage of that as we do our work. And then I know Holly had this question, how do we have it last? Let's, you know, in DOD, we call them DOD directives, and other agencies have their own format, but the directives outlast outlasted administration. And so people in DOD now should be thinking about what portions of these recent reports should be used to update. The existing directives are already pretty good. I mean, John did a lot, and there was a lot on the books even before that, but on climate adaptation and resilience, and now also in the area of strategic planning. So those DOD directives should be updated and put in place as soon as possible. And that helps embed a lasting process.
Great. Thank you all for those thoughts. Those are excellent concrete actions. There's a lot of concrete discussion today, which I think is really important. Thanks to our participants for joining us, the great questions in the box. As Brigitte put in the chat, this will be posted on our website shortly. And we hope you'll continue to engage with us at the Center for Climate and Security. And thanks for all of your hard work on these issues. And thanks to my panelists today for a great conversation. All right.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Erin.